There you go. We're seeing the presentation.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for having me today. You did a good introduction, so I don't have to introduce myself. Can you all hear me okay? Do I sound fine, Chip?
Yeah, you sound good.
Okay. So I've been invited today to share lessons learned from a project that the Nature Conservancy has done with Willie Goldsmith at Pelagic Strategies. And the project is an analysis of all the various electronic, marine, recreational reporting platforms available in the US. We're calling this the landscape of apps out there. We're calling it the appscape. Funny little term we came up with. I want to thank Willie today for the slides and the talking points. Usually he does this presentation, but I'm up to bat today. So once we get to the question and discussion period, I do have my two colleagues, David Moss, who's based in Florida. He's with the Nature Conservancy, and Brendan Rundy with TNC is based in North Carolina. And so I might invite them to answer some of the questions too, as this was a group effort and we're missing Willie today. So I'm going to present a cursory overview of what we found in this analysis. And we have a more detailed white paper that can be shared around afterwards. And we're also working on a manuscript that we're about ready to submit for peer review. No surprise to anybody in this region, but globally there's a growing recognition of the potential for recreational fishing to be a significant contributor to fishing mortality for some species. And the graph on the right, the dark blue bars show the proportion of recreational harvest compared with total harvest for some key species in the southeast. For many species, the recreational sector does account for a dominant share of harvest. As a result, and with ongoing discussions around MRIP, there's real interest in improving real-time data collection as well as data collection at a finer geographic scale. And there's been growing interest in electronic reporting tools to leverage technology that's available to improve this real-time and higher resolution spatial and temporal data. There's been a proliferation of electronic self-reporting programs, and there's sort of two different types that we've grouped into two different categories. There's programs dedicated to estimating catch and effort for quota monitoring purposes and ensuring that ACLs or sub-ACLs aren't being exceeded. And the second is for more targeted kind of citizen science efforts, thinking about specific questions that anglers can help answer through fisheries-dependent data collection. Let's see here. So the challenge is that it's been a pretty organic process as the technology has become more accessible. There's been a whole variety of different programs that have evolved over the past decade or so. And frankly, I found it really hard to keep track of all of the different programs and apps. What fishery has what app, how many users are there, what data is actually being collected, and is it being used for assessment or management? And so partly that was the inspiration for this project. And then also in 2019, I was appointed to the Mid-Atlantic Council as one of Virginia's representatives. And at that time, and still, the council was really struggling with the management of the species that have a significant rec component. So bluefish, black sea bass, scup, summer flounder. And so it just really, I've been thinking a lot about recreational fisheries and data that goes into the management process. And so the Nature Conservancy contracted with Willie Goldsmith at Pelagic Strategies to do an analysis to get an idea of what's out there, what programs are working, what isn't, are there lessons to be learned from a variety of programs that we can use to improve programs or to inform future efforts. So where can we move where can we move in the future to make sure that electronic reporting is as valuable to research and management as it possibly can be? The goal of the study was to comprehensively characterize all of the existing self-reporting programs in the U.S. marine fisheries. And we're not just looking at programs for which there are mobile apps. Some of the programs did have a web component too, and there even were some with a paper component. But as far as trying to focus the scope of the work, we really did try to focus in on the electronic reporting element. Also, in defining the scope, our main priority was thinking about management, data collection for scientific purposes and for managing fisheries. So we were looking at what private anglers were collecting. The programs we identified weren't necessarily exclusive to private anglers, but that's what we wanted to focus on given the how challenging it is to collect information from that sector. And we were both looking at census programs. For example, some of the programs out of the Gulf of Mexico focused on quota monitoring for red snapper. And we were also looking at citizen science programs, for example, for striped bass. So the approach we took was pretty straightforward. We did some scoping by reviewing the existing literature, looking online at various management entities to see what programs were out there, and then having a series of conversations with different subject matter experts. And so after we ID'd the suite of programs that are out there, we chose a representative subsample of them for a series of 1-hour semi-structured interviews. And we really tried to get a cross-section of species, geographic scope, purpose of the program, trying to get as broad a subset as we could. And then we synthesized the findings across a number of common themes that arose from those interviews. So our focus for the interviews was mostly on administrators of the programs, and typically those were a manager, a fisheries manager, maybe state agency, versus folks that were developing the software themselves. But we did speak with a couple of developers because some of those folks have worked on multiple projects or reporting programs over the years, and we did think that that input would be valuable for this project as well. So I'll start with just a general overview of what we found. We ID'd over 25 active programs in the US, and this is a bit of a conservative accounting because in some states, for example, on the West Coast, there were multiple programs housed under the same umbrella. For like California has a program for steelhead, salmon, and sturgeon, but we counted that all as a single program. So it's a bit of a conservative accounting of number of programs. And overall, half the program we identified focused on Atlantic coast fisheries. The others were focused on West Coast, Gulf of Mexico, and then some programs that were more national in scope. And of those 25, we conducted interviews with 12 programs. And we identified discontinued programs as well, and we did do 2 interviews with discontinued programs. And we interviewed 3 developers. Some of the programs that we were talking about are really only a few years old, so there's been an explosion of programs in the last 5 years or so. And I also wanted to mention that 2/3 of the programs did have a smartphone app component, and most of those provided the ability to submit data either online or from a smartphone app. And then the other third allowed for data submission via the web only, online only. One of the big questions that we had about these programs were how are the data actually being used? And we learned of some examples where there was a qualitative process in which these data were being used. The SAFMC release program and NOAA's HMS automated reporting system for tunas, billfishes, and sharks, where the data are more used to keep a finger on the pulse of the fishery. but not necessarily a holistic or comprehensive way, but just to kind of see where there's pulses of activity, or to kind of ground truth elements of data that are accessed and collected elsewhere. Also, we did hear that there were some examples of successful real-time data collection to help develop an overall estimate of fisheries catch and effort, particularly down in the Gulf of Mexico, where Mississippi and Alabama have developed and implemented the tails and scales and the snapper check programs respectively. And both of these were certified for use and management by NOAA Fisheries back in 2018. And the plot on the bottom right is from Alabama's DCNR website, using snapper check data to demonstrate harvest and track progress to the quota over the year and comparing across years. So relatively few programs overall were being actively or systematically applied to the assessment and management process. Part of that is because these programs are really new, so there isn't necessarily a time series that's been built up. However, there are some programs such as Got One, which is being used to fill specific gaps within an assessment with targeted data collection, such as release lengths for striped bass in Massachusetts. That's a new project happening. So based on all the interviews we did, we were able to identify several themes across programs. And these themes offer insight into program success or opportunities for improvement. And some of these might be pretty intuitive and others were a bit more surprising to us. But we hope that collectively these themes can kind of guide the conversation around private recreational data collection going forward. So the first theme was the importance of an outside threat, actually needing something to be wrong, something that could be readily observed by anglers that affected them directly on the water that got them to participate. So one example that we heard was snook down in Florida. There was a cold snap event in 2010 and it resulted in a major die-off of snook. And we learned that iAngler, which was a program that was developed in response to this, really saw a lot of participation from anglers who were concerned about this population, and ultimately that resulted in large-scale participation in the data collection. And so then the data collected through the iAngler program was able to be incorporated into the next stock assessment for that species. A similar concern, although not nature related, was down in the Gulf of Mexico, where there were concerns about data collection and management of the red snapper fishery. And that's been contributing to a contributing factor to high participation rates in some of those Gulf snapper programs that I mentioned earlier. On the other hand, we learned that when there are kind of less bad things happening, or that things are moving along in an uneventful fashion in a fishery, it can be a little bit difficult to get people to engage proactively and to get the data streams that can be used to prevent issues in the future. So we learned about this in a couple of contexts from our interviews. In the HMS fishery, estimated compliance for Atlantic bluefin tuna is only around 40%. In another example, the Mid-Atlantic Council implemented a mandatory recreational tilefish reporting program. It was about 4 years ago now, and I think there's only something like tens of trips are reported annually in that program. So those are just some examples where there are not concerns about the fishery front and center. And so there haven't been any dramatic management changes, so there might not be as much interest or drive for participation. And I think one of the lessons there is you can be really proactive in the communications around the data collection program, the purpose of it, and the relevance and importance of it, and how it can be beneficial to the fishery. The second theme that we heard about, and this was related to census data collection programs versus citizen science efforts, was the importance of having mandatory reporting requirements. There are a couple reasons for this. From a data quality standpoint, with a mandatory program, you tend to have higher participation, which can then reduce some of your statistical bias and can lead to more representative estimates of what's going on in the fishery. We learned that there are some sticks or penalties that have been really beneficial for spurring participation. Some regions and some fisheries tend to lend themselves to mandatory reporting and effective enforcement a little bit more readily. For example, if you look at the image on the top right, for the Mississippi Tails and Scales program, where you can see that vessels have to pass through one of these individual passes to get back to port. So that's a pretty easy situation for enforcement officers to intercept folks and confirm that they're participating in the program. The same goes for Virginia's Black Sea Bass program related to the February Black Sea Bass opening of the fishery. It's a smaller number of ports. Actually, I think it's people really going out from maybe one area. And there's also a constricted season. So both of those factors facilitate enforcement. We've learned through the interviews that requiring electronic reporting before folks get to the dock can be really helpful for enforcement. If you have that lag time, then a vessel can say that they will report later on, and then you miss that opportunity. And then for fisheries that are more diffuse, say shore-based fisheries that are accessed by boat ram, or ones that are accessed by boat rams or public docks, it can be a lot more difficult to effectively enforce. The third theme was around incentives. And we learned that there are different types of incentives that can drive participation in a few different ways. Some incentives might be in the form of kind of swag or stuff. We heard about lotteries that were used in some volunteer surveys to get folks in the door and initially excited about participation. Talking to North Carolina's Catch You Later program that was developed for flounder species and was incentivized, and it incentivized people not just to get in the door, but also actively participating. And there was a stepwise level of swag, if you will, for people who were participating more often or readily. So while material incentives are used to increase participation, there can sometimes be concern that if the reward is too great, you could possibly risk perverse incentives, like people reporting too much or reporting something different than they're actually seeing on the water in order to receive those awards. In addition to material incentives, we learned about other types of incentives that have been pretty compelling for participants. South Atlantic, or SAFMC release has developed a participant recognition program for folks who are particularly active in submitting data on their released fish. And we've also heard about programs like Got One that provide logbook functionality, so that just using the program itself is the incentive for fishermen, for anglers. So the functionality of that is when a catch is logged, the app automatically pulls all kinds of information, like wind direction, tide, phase of the moon, water temperature, all of that is logged along with their catch automatically. So that an angler can very simply keep track of their catches and the corresponding environmental conditions to inform their future fishing activity. And they can look back and see upon what conditions did they catch the biggest or most fish. Also, perhaps the most obvious incentive, but maybe the most challenging, is actually seeing opportunities or improvements in the fishery over time based on improved data collection. So for example, in Gulf red snapper, that situation, and thinking about the seasons and regulations. Also in Virginia's Black Sea Bass winter fishery, where mandatory reporting has afforded anglers to be able to actually have a February season when the fishery would otherwise be closed. So those are just some examples of non-material incentives that can increase participation and retention. The fourth kind of theme that we heard about was the really critical nature of continuous feedback and communication with the recreational sector and participants of the fishery. So one of the major challenges that we heard is that change doesn't happen overnight, and while folks might be submitting data for a year and they might be excited to see outcomes, it often takes multiple years to develop a time series for certain uses of the data. So managing expectations of participants and really stressing interim success is something that we heard a lot about. Collecting data in and of itself is a real accomplishment and something that folks should be proud of and continue doing. And so reporting back on those participation rates or just any kind of feedback to the anglers to keep them engaged can be really valuable. So we heard that where folks weren't seeing immediate outcomes or getting the feedback, there can be real challenges in maintaining participation. So iSnapper down in Texas was a good example of that, where anglers were participating, but their seasons kept getting shorter. And so I think that presented a challenge in terms of future participation as well. There were some strategies that we heard about for keeping folks engaged. I showed earlier the Snapper Check program sharing online progress toward achieving the quota on the website weekly with weekly updates. And the SAFMC release also provides regular data summaries, as does Got1. And we also heard from an engagement standpoint, if resources are available, having a dedicated person that anglers can call or speak with that kind of maintains continuity over time, and so they can feel like the data is not going into a black box. That could go a long way toward keeping folks engaged after they've signed up. So getting into validation, which is a critical element of all of this. One thing we heard again and again is that while self-reported data can be a valuable contribution to the science and management process, it often can't stand alone. So there have to be efforts to assess the biases associated with how representative the participants are, say, of the larger fishing community, and also how well the data that's submitted by participants actually reflects what they're seeing or catching on the water. So over the course of the interviews, we realized that the type of validation we kept hearing about again and again fell into two buckets that were identified by NOAA's Marine Fisheries Advisory Committee through their Recreational Electronic Reporting Task Force. There was technology-driven validation or verification, like using GPS to validate that people were actually where they said they were, and also using photos to verify species. So here's a picture from the North Carolina Catch You Later program on the right, where photos are required to ensure that people are identifying one of 3 different flounder species correctly. There's the Gulf, the Southern, or the Summer flounder, which are all encountered in the same area. In addition to technology-driven validation, we heard about comparison-driven validation also. So for example, reported data might be compared with dockside intercepts. We did hear of one case where it was found that anglers were systematically over-reporting their catches. And based on validation processes, the analysts were actually able to correct for that. So comparison-driven validation can be used also to determine the degree to which folks who are participating are representative of the folks who aren't participating. So what does the overall fishery look like? And to assess those biases as well. And it can sometimes be challenging to illustrate how important validation is where it's actually working. But when validation isn't occurring, the issue can become even more evident. So for example, in Virginia's cobia fishery, where there was a mandatory reporting requirement put in place in 2016, it was eventually found that because there was no way to verify what folks were catching and the size that they were catching, it really undermined the data to be used in stock assessment process, and that program was ultimately discontinued. So this appscape is really a complex and crowded space with all these programs kind of developing organically and occurring in concert. And one of the major challenges is that there hasn't been really a set of rules of the road to date. So it can be kind of an issue from a data analysis standpoint, but also if you're an angler, it can be tough to know where do you go, what program do you use, how do you report your catches. For example, if you're a Rhode Island angler and you catch a striped bass, you could report using Rhode Island's angler catch program. You could use Got One, you could use FishBrain, and there's other options as well. So it can be kind of overwhelming for participants. So in speaking with program managers, they did have a couple of different ideas that I just wanted to share. One is the idea of having a one-stop shop, to have one app or program that you can customize or develop multiple programs within it. So we heard that SciFish's umbrella application is one example of that. The other idea is to have one set of data standards that apps must adhere to, which can enable information to be synthesized across different programs, no matter which data collection platform is being used. And then the last, we're almost to the end. This last point, which is fairly self-evident, the idea in thinking about technology and participation is that widespread participation and retention may ultimately rely on some sort of intergenerational cultural shift. And this has been seen in previous studies with younger generation anglers who are significantly more likely to participate in a smartphone app or web-based reporting program. So as we continue to move forward, more folks may become engaged given familiarity and comfort level with electronic technologies. So that concludes the summary of the analysis that we did. And I've been thinking about these results a lot, and if I were to digest this and try to make some recommendations, I'd say that getting the incentives right is really key. And that includes thinking about the value of the experience to the angler, which might be inherent to participating, like I described the logbook aspect of Got One or FishBrain. The angler needs to get some value out of participating, or why would they continue to use it over time? There's also some value in mandatory reporting programs. I think communication early and often, targeted about to setting expectations and program objectives, including the interim objectives that you can report back on and see progress. So if you report back on the participation or the data that was collected as feedback, then that demonstrates progress to participants and can encourage continued participation. And then related to the validation and assessing accuracy and bias, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the big data world that we can apply to fisheries. And I would just encourage more of those conversations as we try to figure out what climate-ready fisheries management actually means in practice. I think there's some component of more real-time data, and I think we can learn about the value and the limitations of big data in an aggregate to inform a path forward. So that is the end of my presentation. I think I have to.
All right, I will take back control.
Okay.
All right, and you should be seeing my screen. Yes. Okay, once again, how to operate the webinar. Let me click on my webcam real quick. You can type a question into the question box. It's highlighted here in green. The questions don't go to everyone, so I'll read those aloud for you. You can also raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon. The hand icon turns red or has a red arrow. That means your hand is raised to ask the question. And then when we're ready to have you speak, click on the red microphone. When that turns green, that indicates that you're unmuted, and we'll be able to hear you on the webinar. And so I see the first person up is Brett Fitzgerald. Brett, you're unmuted. Okay. I see your microphone's unmuted, but we're not hearing you, Brett. Still
Okay.
not. Oh, there you go.
Sorry about that. That was great, Kate. Thank you very much. An excellent summary. There was a point there on theme 4 that you mentioned the need for communication with how the data is used. And I completely agree with that statement. I wanted to point out, though, that an added problem with that, when you're a kind of a secondary data source like we were with Angler Action, with iAngler, not being a state or federal agency ourselves, we have no control over how the data is going to be used. So we have to wait and see. And it ends up being the case that even when the data is used, the lag time on that is so significant that it no longer is a recruiting or retention tool anymore. And I don't know if there's a way around that. You know, I always felt like it was real important to have that that private data source to help build trust with the agencies and show that we're working on this together. Mm-hmm. But in order for that critical piece of information to be able to be used as a retention tool, there'd have to be some type of arrangement or agreement up front that allowed some type of joint communication with as far as data usage goes. And that's really all I wanted to say. Because I agree that was probably the most important aspect. And of the hundreds of times that I spoke to fishing clubs, that was always the first question asked, was how is the data going to be used? And ultimately, what led to us stepping back in our promotions on that was we no longer could truthfully answer that question in a way that would keep people interested. So yeah. That's all.
I mean, that's a really important and insightful point. And I mean, that was, and one of some of the interviews we heard sort of said, well, you could at least report some sort of interim data back. So while it wouldn't be like, well, this is how exactly it was used in management, perhaps there's an opportunity to report usership or number of catches reported, or, you know, I don't exactly know what might be relevant to your situation, but just some sort of satisfaction back to the anglers that they can kind of see, because when you're contributing to something, of course you're excited about it and you want to see the results. And so yeah, it's a really good point.
Yeah, it was that I became really paranoid about reporting information that might be construed as conflicting with what the agency ends up coming around and using. And again, that ends up just reducing trust and credibility for both us and the agency. So it's a really difficult challenge, and would require, if in the future an agency was going to work with private data partners, I think is something that has to be really laid out well in advance.
Mm-hmm.
All right, any other questions? If not, I will ask one. During your interviews with all these different folks, did you get a feeling that they would be willing to enter their data into a centralized database so it potentially could be used? I feel like with just the number of apps out there, it could be a challenge to try to get the data entered into a centralized database and then be able to see if you could go to a big data platform.
Yeah, I mean, there was such a wide variety of programs and situations that we encountered, and I definitely think that some of them, yes, are willing. I mean, the reason that the data is being collected is to hopefully achieve some, you know, good management and conservation outcomes. So, but also just having some sort of minimum data standards. I think it was Luyen of Got One mentioned like gasoline. You want to make sure that gasoline is actually, you know, what's in it is standard across the board, but where you get your gasoline, and there's a lot of choice there. So it's for certain data elements, having minimum data standards can help with that kind of compiling. And I just want to say, David Moss or Brendan, you know, if you want to jump in, and you all are part of this study too. So if you want to add into any of the responses, I don't know if they're unmuted, Chip, or.
They are unmuted. If you guys just want to raise your hand, we'll recognize you so the audience knows who's speaking. Go ahead, Brendan.
Thanks, Chip, and thanks, Kate. I would just add, in addition to what Kate has already said, that I think in the recreational sector, those who are paying attention to management and are collecting data have the overwhelming feeling of, here's my data, please use it. And so if there happened to be an opportunity, assuming that the data passed some minimum standards, an opportunity to share with a centralized database, by and large, I think that the individuals who are collecting those data would be happy to provide it. That's the feeling that I got.
And of course, there's, you know, with these apps, there's some strict user agreements about keeping portions of it confidential, and so, but that would all be part of the discussion about what is able to be shared and what isn't.
All right, the next question is from Spud.
Thank you, Chip. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thanks. And thanks, Kate, for the presentation. I appreciate someone diving into this complicated topic area. You know, I think as a former state manager and now involved in interstate and federal fisheries management, we're always looking for the next silver bullet to solve our problems. And I think there's been a belief that self-reporting through electronic means could be maybe not a silver bullet, but maybe a really good lead bullet. But so it's nice to hear a discussion about the pros and cons. But you know, I did really appreciate that. I guess it was theme 7 talking about the intergenerational component of this, because as a baby boomer digital immigrant, you know, I approach these things completely different than, you know, these 20-something-year-olds that I mentored all through their youth to be fishermen. You know, they're dealing with this stuff completely different than us. So I think we're going to see that happen. You know, I was very hopeful that electronic self-reporting could fill in some of the gaps that we're seeing with MRIP, because as it was mentioned about using MRIP as a reference, well, you know, MRIP is increasingly missing a lot of very avid and capable anglers because they're going to private access points. Whereas at least the electronic self-reporting has a potential, you know, to bring that data into the data stream. But following up on what Brett had to say, I think the biggest challenge, and it's been this way with every citizen science endeavor I've been involved in, is communicating to people that just because you submit your data doesn't mean you're going to change an outcome to something different than you thought. And that, unfortunately, is an unpopular truth that you owe people to participate in this. But that can be a major disincentive because they feel like their experiences are the real data, and all the stuff they see in assessments and management plans are just a bunch of statistical mumbo jumbo. So I think that communication on the front end as well as the follow-up on the back end is the only thing that's going to make this be a significant contributor in a positive way. So again, I appreciate the presentation.
Thanks, Spud. Yeah, I've been doing this, and Willie's been doing this presentation in several different venues, and just kind of using it as a conversation starter. And I know these issues are on the top of so many folks' mind, and even my colleague David Moss is working with Chip at the South Atlantic Council to think about a pilot program for some rare event deep water species. And so can some of this analysis inform that effort that they're doing? So yeah, it's been a really interesting exercise, and I'm still, there's been a lot done in this space, and just trying to kind of make some sense out of it all and learn from it is what we're trying to do.
All right, Julia has her hand up. Julia, it's showing you're still muted. There you go.
All right. Hey, Kate, thanks so much for the presentation. Y'all did great work kind of digging into this subject, and I just wanted to share a little information and ask a question too, kind of following up on some of what you and Brendan mentioned about trying to have kind of information from these different apps in one kind of centralized database or location. And I think glad that from y'all talking to people, you're able to kind of see that there seems to be an interest in doing that. And I know I was involved in the development of the SciFish kind of app with ACCSP. And so one thing that they're trying to do is not only kind of have a platform that can house multiple apps, but also have an API that other kind of private apps or commercial apps could use to kind of share information with the ACCSP's kind of data warehouse. And by doing that, they're trying to adhere to kind of the ACCSP data standards. So that may be kind of a step in the direction of some of the kind of work that y'all were talking about in that area. So that was one thing. And then my question is, I know you guys talked a lot to folks who did kind of mandatory reporting programs and kind of voluntary, more citizen science-based reporting programs, and you kind of came up with these multiple theme areas. Did those theme areas pop up for the mandatory reporting and the voluntary reporting apps? Did those themes cross all of those, or there's some that seem to kind of hold stronger for mandatory apps versus voluntary apps? Does that make, I don't know if that makes sense what I'm asking.
Yeah, I know what you're asking. I'm trying to think about what the answer is. So, I mean, I think that these things we came up with were sort of kind of across the board from most of the interviews that we did. So I didn't see an obvious distinction with reporting or mandatory versus voluntary. No, I mean, I'd have to think a little bit more about that, but Brendan or Moss, did you have the sense that, I mean, I don't think so. I think they were kind of universal.
Go ahead, Brendan.
Thanks for the question, Julia. I think it's a good one. I think it's important to remember, as I'm sure you do, that even the mandatory programs require quotations around that word. and that the things like incentives are going to be helpful in getting people to participate, even if the law says they have to. Because I think we all appreciate that something like 80% is in a mandatory program, everyone would pat themselves on the back if that were the compliance rate. So yeah, I think overall these themes transcend whether or not the program is mandatory or voluntary.
And Julia, just to follow up on the first comment that you had said, the idea of sort of a central database, that wasn't a recommendation from us, but it was something that came up in some of the conversations. And so it's on my list to talk with ACCSP again. And because I know, and they also have some data standards. So, they are well on the way to and have been thinking about these issues for a long time. So yeah, they're certainly a resource, and I have it right on my scratch pad here. If any of you ACCSP people are on, I'm going to be emailing you.
All right, Brett Fitzgerald had a question. With websites becoming more responsive to mobile smart devices, do you think there's a need to keep developing or building apps, or can we start to rely solely on websites, which can be manipulated on a smartphone almost as easily, especially if we're moving towards capturing minimum data fields instead of huge wads of info each and every trip?
Yeah, so I mean, that is a question for more of a developer type computer software person, but from what I can tell, yes, I agree that the web interfaces are getting a lot more easy to navigate on your cell phone. So whether or not you use the actual app that you download or just navigate through the web, I think that those are becoming a lot more seamless. So I think when I use the term app, it doesn't necessarily have to be an app that you download on your phone. It could be also accessed through the web version. I hope I'm addressing that question. I think I understood it as you meant it.
Yeah, I think you answered it very well. And the other thing I would point out is web services aren't offshore for everyone. So that could be a challenge for some fisheries.
And I do know that the technology is evolving such that, you open your app up offshore and you can log your data. And then as soon as you get in cell range, it will automatically upload and you don't even know what's happening. So being offshore and out of range is no longer, a deal breaker.
Right. Brendan?
Yeah, thanks. I was just going to jump in and reinforce that point because I think that's the really critical thing about apps versus the web interface is that you can download that interface as an app and be able to access it regardless of your connectivity, whereas you would not be able to load the website if you're offline. And of course, especially in the South Atlantic, we're looking towards having things like this available for the offshore fisheries where you wouldn't necessarily be able to connect to a website.
All right, and the next question we have written is from Jenny McClare. Curious to know if you've received any feedback on what aspects of the logbook feature was most incentivizing. Is it having their trips summarized in a central place, or being able to share the trip with a broader group provides a sense of community?
So I can comment. I am not remembering as much about the fish brain off the top of my head, and I can comment on the Got One logbook feature that folks seem to like is it provides graphs of your catches, in comparison with different environmental variables. So how many fish did you catch? How many striped bass did you catch at this phase of the moon? And you can see on the graph, and you can clearly see which phase of the moon had the highest catches. So it was that sort of functionality that was just summarized like on the click of a button, just so easy to, you know, I think over time when you fish, you're just like, I'm pretty sure I know I always do the best when the moon is full and I go to this certain spot, the water's running in this way. But to have that actually summarized and confirmed what your memory thinks it remembers is really intriguing.
I like that statement. You think you remember.
Yeah, well, you think you remember.
Brett did have a follow-up. He stated apps are expensive to maintain, and I've found that many offshore anglers don't log until they are home anyways.
Yeah.
Julia?
Yeah, this is, I guess, less of a question, but something to kind of add in to what kind of Kate was talking about and the question about, you know, what's the incentive for folks to participate? Is it to get this kind of information about their catches that kind of Kate talked about, or this, the other idea was kind of this sense of community. And I was at a meeting with some of with a variety of app developers recently, and one of the things that they said was really important was to have kind of options of how people want to share information with other people within the app. So FishBrain has an incredibly large community of anglers that kind of uses that app, but there are options whether people want to, what people want to share with other anglers in their region. So if they want to keep some information private, they can and can't. And that was one of the things that they multiple kind of commercial app developers noted was really, they felt was really important to their kind of business model, is so people can be involved in the community and share information at different levels of whatever they're kind of comfortable with. So I think that was kind of a little bit off topic here, but something that I thought was really interesting and maybe kind of interest to that point as well.
Well, yeah, thanks for sharing that, because I think that speaks to the point that one of the last questions a little farther back was asked about what do folks really like about the functionality of some of those.
All right, well, I'm not seeing any hands or questions in the log. I'll ask another one. You had mentioned that the Atlantic coast had, I think, around half the apps developed for the Atlantic coast compared to the Gulf and the Pacific. And I was just curious, why do you think there's such a number of apps available on the Atlantic coast compared to the other regions?
Yeah, it wasn't just apps, it was
Websites.
reporting. Well, and this is part of the answer, is like there's striped bass reporting for so many different states. And so I think part of that added up, increased the numbers a little bit. And also the variety of fisheries is a little bit more wide variety on the Atlantic coast versus, well, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say that, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's my first inclination, is just that there were all these different, like each state has a striped bass reporting option, and I don't know, Brendan, you have any insight there? Maybe not.
Yeah, I guess I'll just jump in and say I think we have an embarrassment of fishes on the East Coast. We've got 3 councils, SAFMC, 14 states, and everything from tropical to temperate to the tundra of Maine. So yeah, I think that's basically it. We're just more diverse than the Gulf in terms of the species present and the management frameworks.
David, I saw you had your hand up for a second.
Yeah, well, Brendan and Kate both hit on it, but it's just, as Brendan said, an embarrassment of riches as far as species goes. And there's, as Kate said, some apps that are focused on a single species. So, you know, that adds to it. And then just from a population standpoint as well. On the eastern seaboard, obviously, we have a lot more participation, so there's just more to choose from.
All right, any other hands or questions? I think we've had a really good discussion here, learned about some potential issues, and some definite challenges along the way with some of these self-reporting apps. Any final words, Kate?
Just thanks so much for inviting us to speak. We have a great number of participants in this session, so that's fantastic. And like I said, I just want to keep the conversation going and build on this work. So I appreciate the invitation and everyone's time to tune in.
Yeah, thank you so much for presenting to us. It was we look forward to hearing more information on this. I think it is going to be discussions for management going forward. I know there's significant discussions around the South Atlantic table on permitting, not necessarily reporting right now, but there's also been discussion about reporting in the past.
Yeah, the reporting, and then even in the Mid-Atlantic Council, there is an amendment that has been started, and it's called sector separation and catch accounting. I don't think anybody really knows what that means yet, but just trying to have these conversations and think about eventually moving forward on some of these initiatives. So.
All right, well, thanks everyone for attending. Our next seminar is going to be in July, and it is going to be on low recruitment issues that we're having in the South Atlantic region, presented by NOAA Fisheries. So thank you all very much. Have a great day.
Bye. Thanks.